The banquet hall lights were far too bright. They reflected off the polished linoleum floors, making the whole room feel like a sterile hospital ward instead of a corporate celebration. My name is Arthur Sterling, and for 25 years, I had been the silent engine behind Global Freight Solutions. I was not the kind of man who sought the spotlight, but tonight was supposed to be different. It was my quarter-century anniversary. According to the company policy I helped draft 2 decades ago, 25 years meant a meaningful retirement plan bonus or at least a gold watch. I stood on the stage, waiting for the CEO to acknowledge the infrastructure I had built, the complex routing systems, the logistical networks that moved millions of dollars of cargo across the globe every single day. Instead, Preston, the new VP of Operations, stepped up to the microphone. Preston had been with the company for exactly 8 months. He was 30 years old, wore suits that cost more than my first car, and had never spent a single night in a warehouse. He flashed that practiced, toothy smile that never reached his cold, hollow eyes. "Arthur," he said, his voice booming over the speakers, "for your loyal service, we wanted to show our appreciation." He reached into his expensive jacket pocket and pulled out a small, printed card. It was not a watch. It was not a bonus check. He pressed it into my hand with a cold, condescending pat on my shoulder that felt like a deliberate jab. It was a $10 gift card to Java Joe's, a mediocre coffee chain right outside our office building. The room went silent. I looked down at the plastic card in my hand. $10. That was the value they placed on 25 years of sleepless nights, missed anniversaries, and the complex, custom software that held their entire business together. The silence in the room was suffocating. I could see the board members at the front table shifting in their seats. They were smiling, but it was a forced, stiff expression, like they were watching a car crash and did not know whether to look away or applaud. Preston leaned into the mic, waiting for me to thank him. He wanted show of gratitude. He wanted me to act like a humble employee who was honored by his patronizing generosity. Instead, I just stared at him. I did not say a word. I did not need to. In that split second, the anger I expected to feel did not come. Instead, it was replaced by a strange, icy clarity. It was a moment of absolute truth. I looked at the cheap coffee chain logo on the card, then back at Preston, and realized I had been wrong about everything. I had spent a quarter of a century believing that loyalty was a currency. I thought if I gave the company my best years, my sanity, and my focus, they would look after me. That $10 card was the final proof that they did not even see me as a person. To them, I was just a part of the machine that was finally starting to rattle. And that was the moment I stopped caring about the machine entirely. I took the card from Preston's hand and tucked it into my pocket, not because I wanted it, but because I did not want to cause a scene. I walked off the stage to the polite, shallow applause of people who did not even know what my job description was. I took my seat at the back of the hall and closed my eyes, letting the memories wash over me. It had not always been like this. I remember the early days when Global Freight Solutions was nothing but a cramped, leaky garage and a desperate, beautiful dream. Back then, I was not just an employee. I was the architect. I wrote the initial lines of code that tracked our shipments. I configured the servers on the cold concrete floor because we could not afford IT support. I remember the winter of 2004, when our main distribution system went down during a massive blizzard. I did not go home for 3 days. I slept on a folding cot in the corner of the office, fueled by black coffee and the desperate need to keep our clients' cargo moving. My daughter was 5 years old then, and I missed her school play because a load of critical medical supplies was stuck in transit in Chicago. I fixed the routing error. I made sure it got to its destination on time, saving the company's reputation and securing the massive contract that would eventually fund our national expansion. That was the price of the life I chose. I sacrificed the easy moments for the stability of the company. Over the years, I became the person everyone went to when things broke. Ask Arthur, they would say. Arthur knows the legacy code. Arthur can fix the database. I was the glue. I did not do it for the money, although I was compensated fairly. I did it because I believed that if I built something strong enough, it would eventually support me in return. I had built a digital infrastructure that was practically invisible to the people upstairs, but entirely essential to the company's survival. It was a complex, beautiful, and deeply customized system that accounted for every possible failure point. It required a deep understanding of logistics, engineering, and sheer grit. I never let a shipment fail. Not one. I carried the weight of the company on my shoulders, treating every project like it was my own business. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe to join our community. I share real workplace stories every day for anyone who believes quiet competence should always be respected. Looking back, I realized that pride was my weakness. I took so much ownership of the company that I forgot I was ultimately replaceable in their eyes. They did not see the years of dedication or the nights under the desk. They only saw a line item on a budget that was getting older and more expensive. As I sat there in that banquet hall, listening to the CEO give a speech about innovation and future-proofing, I could not help but smile to myself. They were so busy looking at the future that they did not realize they had just insulted the only person who knew how to keep the present from falling apart. The trap was already set, and I had not even had to lift a finger to build it. 6 months before that anniversary party, the atmosphere at Global Freight Solutions shifted. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, creeping rot. The board brought in a team of consultants led by Preston, who had recently been promoted to VP of Operations. They weren't there to streamline logistics or improve our shipping times. They were there for digital transformation. Preston brought an entourage of young associates, all in their late 20s, wearing slim-fit suits and carrying tablets instead of notebooks. They called themselves the Modernizers. They looked at our routing system, the one I had built to handle everything from port strikes to winter storms, and they saw an old, dusty dinosaur. To them, my code was not a foundation. It was a barrier to progress. I tried to warn them early on. I remember sitting in a glass-walled conference room while one of Preston's associates, a sharp-featured man named David, explained how they were going to replace our manual routing safeguards with an automated API. I spoke up, keeping my voice steady. I explained that our custom system relied on real-world data checks. I told them that an automated program couldn't account for the subtle, human decisions we made when a port was jammed or a driver was stuck. I told them that if they removed the manual override, the whole chain would snap under the first sign of pressure. David just laughed. He looked at Preston, who was scrolling through his phone, and said, "Arthur, that's exactly the kind of legacy thinking we're here to fix. The new algorithm learns. It adapts. It doesn't need a human babysitter." They didn't just ignore my advice. They treated it like a confession of incompetence. They thought my caution was fear of change. They didn't understand that I wasn't afraid of the new technology. I was afraid of the blind faith they had in it. They started stripping away the safeguards one by one. They turned off the manual error reporting features I'd written into the core. They cut the human verification steps. Every time they removed a layer of my system, I felt a physical sting. It was like watching someone take a sledgehammer to a house I had spent years carefully framing, just because they thought the walls were unnecessary. They were replacing precision with speed. They were trading reliability for a prettier interface. I watched as they pushed code updates live, without running them through the stress tests I had established as standard procedure. They were so proud of their efficiency. They loved the way their dashboards looked, all shiny graphs and green check marks. They didn't see the reality underneath. They were building a car with no brakes, convinced that because the engine sounded louder, it must be driving better. I kept my head down, did my work, and started saving copies of every single warning I had given them, along with the timestamps of every time they told me to be quiet. I wasn't just watching a disaster. I was documenting its construction. The isolation started shortly after they implemented their first optimization update. It was subtle at first. I stopped getting calendar invites for the weekly strategy meetings. Then, my access to the internal servers, access I had held for over 2 decades, was suddenly restricted. I wasn't locked out, exactly, but I was pushed into a read-only role. Then came the physical move. Preston decided that the modern office floor plan needed more open space for collaboration. He told me that my office, which I had occupied for 10 years, was being converted into a huddle room for the marketing team. I was told to pack up my things. They didn't move me to a different office. They moved me to a tiny, windowless storage closet at the back of the warehouse facility. It was barely big enough for a desk and a chair, located right next to the noisy industrial shredder. It was a clear message delivered without a single word. You are not important anymore. I remember walking into my new office. The fluorescent light hummed in a way that gave me a headache within minutes. I sat down and looked at the boxes of files I had carried over from my old space. I could have protested. I could have gone to HR. I could have stormed into the CEO's office and demanded respect. But I knew that would only make them think they were winning. So I did nothing. I set up my monitor, connected my laptop, and went back to work. Even in that closet, they couldn't help but poke at me. Preston would walk by, occasionally glancing into my room with a smug, condescending smile. He'd make comments like, "Getting enough air back there, Arthur," or "Don't get too comfortable, we're automating your role soon." I stayed silent. I just looked at him, gave a small nod, and went back to my terminal. The irony was that even as they sidelined me, they still relied on me. When the new and improved system stuttered, one of their junior developers would sheepishly knock on my door. They'd ask me, "Hey Arthur, the database is throwing an error code. Do you know why?" I would calmly walk them through the solution, fixing the mess they made in 10 minutes. I didn't scold them. I didn't belittle them. I just fixed the problem so the company wouldn't suffer. But every time I did it, I made sure to send an email to Preston's team documenting the fix. I was building a paper trail, piece by piece, proving that their algorithm was a failure and that I was the only thing keeping the lights on. I wasn't being sidelined. I was being set free. The more they pushed me away, the less I felt obligated to catch them when they inevitably fell. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, the day our largest quarterly logistics contract was set for renewal. It was our most critical shipment cycle of the year. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of electronics were moving from the ports to our warehouses, and every step of the process was now governed by the streamlined, automated system Preston had forced upon us. I was sitting in my closet office, drinking my coffee, when the first alert hit my screen. It was an internal monitor I still had running, a ghost of the system I had built. The algorithm was flagging a massive bottleneck at the primary import hub. It wasn't just a small delay. The system was misrouting shipments to facilities that didn't have the capacity to handle them. It was a classic cascading failure. Because the code had no human oversight, the system just kept making the same mistake over and over, piling up errors like a train wreck in slow motion. I saw the notifications flooding the main operations channel. Preston and his team were scrambling, trying to override the settings, but they didn't understand the underlying architecture. They were treating the symptoms, not the disease. They were trying to plug a dam with their fingers while the water was already rising above their heads. I knew exactly what would happen next. Within an hour, the trucks would stop moving. Within 3 hours, the clients would be calling in a panic. Within 6 hours, the reputation of Global Freight Solutions would be in tatters. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe to join our community. I share real workplace stories every day for anyone who believes quiet competence should always be respected. I stood up and smoothed out my shirt. I felt no urge to run out there and play the hero. That was my old role, and I was finished with it. I opened my email and drafted a short, professional resignation letter. I kept it brief. No complaints, no accusations, just a statement of resignation effective immediately. I attached a document explaining the core issue with the routing algorithm, but I knew they wouldn't understand it in time to stop the bleeding. Then, I turned to my computer. I opened the administrative backend, the master key access I had built years ago. It was the only part of the system that allowed for a complete manual reset of the routing engine. I didn't delete the code. I simply changed the access permissions. I set the master account to expire at exactly midnight that night. After that, the system would be fully autonomous, and without the master key, it would be impossible for anyone, even the head of IT, to bypass the faulty logic Preston had installed. I packed my few personal belongings into a cardboard box. It didn't take long. A picture of my daughter, a favorite mug, and a few reference books. I walked out of the closet and down the long, carpeted hallway. It was strangely quiet. The office was buzzing with low-level panic as people started to realize the screens were going red. I walked past Preston's office. He was standing there, shouting into his phone, his face bright red, veins bulging in his neck. He looked terrified. He didn't even notice me walk past his open door. I didn't stop to gloat. I didn't stop to say goodbye. I just kept walking. The exit door clicked shut behind me, the sound final and clean. I walked out into the parking lot. The air was cool and crisp. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, listening to the engine hum. I looked back at the building one last time. It looked exactly as it had for the last 25 years, a dull gray structure. But I knew that inside the clock was ticking. By tomorrow morning, the company I had built would look very different. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove home. And for the first time in 2 decades, I didn't think about the routing schedule. I just drove. I got home, poured a glass of water, and sat in my armchair in the living room. It was 6 p.m. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a warm, orange glow across my lawn. My house was silent, peaceful in mine. I had turned my work phone off as soon as I left the parking lot. I didn't want to hear the noise. I didn't want to be involved in the inevitable scramble. The first ring came at 7:30 p.m. It was one of the junior logistics coordinators, a kid named Mark who had been trying to follow Preston's orders for months. I let it go to voicemail. He left a frantic message, asking for a quick question about the routing system. He sounded like he was on the verge of a breakdown. By 8:15 p.m., the calls started coming in faster. A manager from the warehouse called, then the head of client services. I didn't pick up. I knew exactly what they wanted. They were hitting the wall. The trucks were stalled at the port, the drivers were idling, and the clients were screaming. The streamlined system was completely locked. The errors had multiplied, and the whole network was frozen. At 9 p.m., the phone rang with a number I recognized immediately, the VP of Operations. Preston. He called 3 times in a row. I didn't answer. I could imagine the scene in his office, the frantic pacing, the discarded takeout containers, the sweat on his brow as he realized his career was evaporating in real time. He was realizing that his modernization project had just cost the company millions, and he was the one who would have to answer for it. At 10 p.m., the CEO called. Even then, I didn't flinch. I sat there and watched a movie. I wanted to be fully disconnected. I wanted to enjoy the silence of my own home, completely separate from the company that had reduced my quarter-century of service to a $10 gift card. Around 11 p.m., I finally turned on my laptop and logged into a public industry forum where I had a few friends. The chatter was already starting. People were talking about a major disruption at Global Freight Solutions. Word had leaked. Clients were posting on social media, complaining that their shipments were stuck in limbo. I read the comments with a cold, detached satisfaction. I saw a screenshot of a memo being sent to the board. The company's stock price was starting to dip in after-hours trading. I looked at the clock. 11:55 p.m. In 5 minutes, the master key would expire. The final piece of my legacy would be locked away. Whatever they tried to do to fix the mess, they would be doing it without me. They were flying blind, trying to repair a plane that was already in a nosedive. I felt a strange sense of lightness. For years, I had worried about the company. I had worried about the shipments, the clients, the efficiency. Now, I felt nothing but relief. I was finally free of the burden. The company wasn't my responsibility anymore. It was their ship, their captain, and their icebergs. I finished my water, closed my laptop, and went to bed. I slept better that night than I had in 25 years. I didn't care what the morning would bring for them. I knew, with absolute certainty, that it wouldn't be good. The knock on my front door came just as I was finishing my first cup of coffee on Wednesday morning. I didn't have to look through the peephole to know who it was. I had been expecting them. I opened the door to find the CEO, Mr. Henderson, and Preston standing on my porch. They looked like they hadn't slept in 48 hours. Henderson's suit was wrinkled, and his tie was crooked. Preston, usually the picture of tailored perfection, looked absolutely haggard. His eyes were bloodshot, and he kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, looking like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. "Arthur," Henderson said, his voice raspy and thin. "We need to talk." I leaned against the doorframe, relaxed. I didn't invite them in. "I'm listening," I replied. Preston stepped forward, his arrogance replaced by a frantic, high-pitched energy. "Arthur, you need to turn the systems back on. We're bleeding cash. The clients are pulling out. The board is calling for heads, and it's a total disaster in there. Just give us the access codes, and we can discuss a new contract." He started listing numbers, bonuses, a promotion to chief technology officer, a massive salary increase. He was throwing money at me like it was a shield, hoping to buy his way out of the mistake he had made. Henderson stood behind him, nodding along, his face a mask of desperate hope. They were offering me the moon, but it was all worthless. I listened to them for a full minute without interrupting. When they finally stopped, waiting for me to jump at the offer, I just shook my head. "You don't understand," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "This isn't about the money, and it's not about the job title. You broke the foundation. You stripped away the safeguards, ignored the warnings, and treated the system like a toy. Now, the house is collapsing, and there's no magic button I can press to fix it. But you're the only one who knows the architecture." Preston blurted out, "You're the only one who can fix the routing errors." "Exactly," I said. "And that was the person you sidelined. That was the person you treated like he was replaceable. You told me the algorithm didn't need me. You told me my legacy thinking was an obstacle. Well, you got your wish. You have a fully automated system, Preston. Now you have to deal with the results." I looked at Henderson. "You made a choice when you hired these people and let them tear apart the work I spent a quarter-century building. You chose the shiny interface over the reliable engine. You chose the modern approach over experience. Now you have to live with that choice. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe to join our community. I share real workplace stories every day for anyone who believes quiet competence should always be respected." They tried to argue. They tried to threaten legal action. But they knew, deep down, that they had no ground to stand on. I hadn't broken the law. I had simply stopped supporting a system they had forced me to abandon. I closed the door, not with a slam, but with a firm, final click. I watched them walk back to their car through the window. They were done. I didn't turn my phone back on that day. I didn't check the emails. I knew that the calls would eventually stop once they realized there was no path back to the way things were. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched the slow-motion aftermath from the outside. The news eventually reached the industry trade journals. Global Freight Solutions had been forced to ground their entire fleet for 3 days while they scrambled to hire an outside firm to rebuild their logistics core from scratch. It cost them millions of dollars in penalties and lost contracts. The most satisfying part was the cleanup. The board finally realized that the modernization strategy was a total failure. Preston was fired, along with the rest of his team. I heard through a former colleague that the departure wasn't graceful. It was a total professional purge. Henderson, the CEO, was forced into an early retirement by the shareholders. The company survived, but it was a shell of its former self, having lost the competitive edge that had taken us 25 years to build. People often ask me if I regret it. They ask if I felt bad for the employees who had to scramble to pick up the pieces, or if I felt guilty about leaving the company in such a state. My answer is always the same. No. I gave that company 25 years of my life. I gave them my best effort, my loyalty, and my expertise. When they decided that I was no longer of value, they made their choice. They decided that they didn't need the person who built their house. They only wanted the house itself. But they forgot that a house needs a foundation to stand. If you pull the foundation out from under it, it doesn't matter how pretty the paint is, the whole thing will come down. I didn't go back to the corporate world, at least not in the same way. I started my own independent consulting firm. Now, I pick the companies I work with. I make sure they value the people who do the real work. I'm paid for my expertise, not for my presence. I'm happier now than I've ever been. My daughter is older, and I have the time to be the father I couldn't be when I was sleeping on that office cot. I have a life that is mine, not the company's. The lesson I learned is simple, and it's the one I hope you take away from my story. Know your worth. If you're the person who holds the system together, don't let anyone convince you that you are a replaceable part. If they treat you like you don't matter, believe them, and then leave. The greatest power you have isn't the ability to keep things running. It's the knowledge of what happens when you decide to stop.